3 minutes ago, a quiet act inside palace walls detonated a royal earthquake no one saw coming. Without ceremony, without Camilla's consent. King Charles alone, deliberate and unshakable, signed away Sandringham, one of the monarchy's most sacred estates, not to his wife, not to his siblings, but to Prince George, the heir after the heir, the child. And in that single moment, centuries of expectation cracked beneath the weight of a pen. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The confirmation did not arrive wrapped in celebration or pride. It arrived wrapped in restraint. Palace language, usually ceremonial and affirming, had instead become calculated and minimal, stripped of warmth and filled with a strange, deliberate calm that insiders recognized immediately as something far more serious than routine inheritance. There were no smiles attached to the announcement, no carefully staged transition of legacy from monarch to successor. Instead, there was only the truth, quiet, irreversible, and already complete. Charles had not announced his intention beforehand. He had not tested the waters. He had acted. And in doing so, he had permanently altered the emotional architecture of the monarchy itself, because Sandringham was never simply land. It was memory carved into permanence. It was Queen Elizabeth II's refuge when the crown demanded too much of her humanity. It was where grief was processed in silence and decisions were made without interference. Charles understood this intimately. He understood that Sandringham represented something deeper than ownership. It represented continuity of emotional authority. And by transferring it directly to George, he had chosen not the present, but the future. Not stability for himself, but stability beyond himself. This was not a decision rooted in comfort. It was rooted in inevitability. What made the moment even more unsettling was how quietly it had been executed. Camilla was not present. She had not witnessed the signature. She had not participated in the conversation. The decision unfolded without her voice, without her influence, and without her consent. By the time she learned of it, it was no longer a possibility, it was reality. The document existed, the future had been secured in ink, and there was nothing anyone could do to reverse it. For a monarchy built on ritual and consultation, this level of solitude was not normal. It was intentional, it was final. Inside palace corridors, the reaction was not loud. It was colder than that. Staff members who had served through decades of royal transitions suddenly found themselves confronting something unprecedented. They understood what Sandringham represented, and more importantly, they understood what it meant that Charles had bypassed every assumed sequence of inheritance. This was not about bypassing protocol, it was about redefining it. George, still so young, had suddenly become something more than an heir. He had become a holder of legacy in his own right, a symbol not of tomorrow but of permanence. Charles himself had shown no hesitation. Those who observed him in the hours following the signature noticed something deeply unsettling in its calmness. He was not conflicted, he was not uncertain, he was resolved. This was not the action of a man reacting emotionally. This was the action of a man concluding something he had long wrestled with privately. The pen had moved steadily. The decision had been made with clarity, and the consequences, whatever they might be, had already been accepted before the ink ever touched the page. Camilla's absence from the process spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. She had not been consulted because Charles did not intend for this decision to be influenced. This was his act, alone, his responsibility, his declaration of belief in something larger than personal relationships or present loyalties. And that belief had a name. George. But what made Sandringham so powerful, so emotionally charged, that giving it to George wasn't merely a transfer of land, but a transfer of destiny itself. Sandringham was never just an estate. It was where monarchs escaped their masks, where Queen Elizabeth found peace when the crown became too heavy, where decisions were made in whispers, far from Parliament and cameras. And now, that same sacred ground, steeped in loyalty, grief and absolute authority, had been quietly handed to a child who had never asked for it, and the question wasn't why George received it, but why Charles gave it away now. To understand the magnitude of Charles's decision, you have to understand what Sandringham truly represented, not in legal terms, but in emotional ones. Sandringham was never owned by the crown in the way other royal residences were. It existed outside the machinery of monarchy, outside its obligations and public expectations. It belonged to the sovereign as a person, not as an institution. It was where power could finally breathe, where the monarch was not a symbol, but human. And that distinction made it the most personal inheritance any ruler could ever pass on. For Queen Elizabeth, Sandringham was more than comfort. It was control in its purest form. It was where she returned when the pressures of public duty threatened to swallow her identity. It was where she reconnected with the core of who she was, beyond titles, beyond ceremony, beyond obligation. Charles had watched her retreat there during moments of exhaustion, during moments of grief, and during moments when the monarchy itself seemed uncertain. He understood, perhaps better than anyone alive, that Sandringham was where strength was rebuilt when everything else felt fragile. That is why his decision carried such enormous emotional weight, because by choosing George, he was not simply transferring ownership, he was transferring sanctuary. He was handing over the one place where the monarchy's future sovereign could remain whole, when everything else demanded sacrifice. And in doing so, he made it clear that Sandringham was not meant to serve the present generation. It was meant to protect the next one. The most striking part of this decision was not who received Sandringham, but who did not. Camilla, despite standing beside Charles as queen, was not included in this emotional inheritance. This was not accidental. It was deliberate, because Sandringham had never been about marriage. It had always been about bloodline. It had always been about continuity that stretched beyond personal relationships and into the permanent structure of royal identity. By giving Sandringham directly to George, Charles reinforced that principle with unmistakable clarity. He was securing the monarchy's emotional centre within the line of succession itself, ensuring that its deepest refuge would remain untouched by shifting alliances or future uncertainties. This decision also revealed something far more profound about Charles's state of mind. He was no longer thinking in terms of his own reign. He was thinking in terms of what would survive him. He understood that George would one day carry burdens heavier than anything he could yet imagine, and Sandringham would become the place where those burdens could be set down, even if only briefly. Charles was not simply giving George land. He was giving him emotional armor, a silent promise that when the world demanded everything from him, there would still be one place that belonged entirely to him. But there was another truth buried beneath this act, a truth that could not be ignored. By accelerating George's connection to Sandringham, Charles was quietly accelerating George's psychological readiness for a future that was approaching faster than anyone wanted to admit. The estate was no longer just a symbol of eventual inheritance. It had become a symbol of preparation, of inevitability, of a future that Charles was already beginning to shape with quiet urgency. And within palace walls, there was one person who understood exactly what this meant, not just for George, not just for Charles, but for herself. She did not raise her voice. She did not object publicly. She did not challenge the decision, because she knew something others were only beginning to realize. Sandringham had never just been a home. It had always been a declaration. But behind palace walls, one person understood immediately what this meant, and her silence would soon become more powerful than words. When Camilla learned Sandringham was no longer within her reach, the palace didn't erupt in shouting, it froze in something far more dangerous. Silence. No official objection. No public acknowledgement. Just controlled composure, masking a truth insiders couldn't ignore. Because this wasn't just about land. It was about trust. About loyalty. About realizing that the man she stood beside had quietly secured a future that did not include her. There are moments in royal life when words become meaningless, when the absence of reaction reveals more than any confrontation ever could. This was one of those moments. Camilla had always understood Sandringham as part of the emotional landscape surrounding Charles, part of the quiet foundation beneath his reign, part of the personal world she had stepped into when she chose to stand beside him. It was never spoken outright, but it was understood. Sandringham was where Charles retreated when everything else became too heavy. And by extension, it was where she believed her presence would remain, not through ownership, but through proximity, through trust. through permanence. But permanence, she was now discovering, had conditions she had never fully seen. Charles had not asked her opinion. He had not hinted at his intention. He had not prepared her emotionally for the shift he was about to create. Instead, he had moved alone, quietly, decisively, in a way that left no space for influence or persuasion. By the time the truth reached her, the outcome had already hardened into reality. There was nothing to debate, nothing to negotiate, nothing to stop. The decision had bypassed her completely, not with cruelty, but with clarity, and that clarity carried a message more unsettling than rejection. It carried certainty. Those closest to Camilla noticed the change immediately, though it was subtle enough to escape public detection. She did not rage. She did not accuse. She did not question Charles publicly or privately, at least not in any way that reached beyond the palace's guarded inner circle. Instead, she absorbed the decision inwardly, processing its meaning in silence. And that silence became its own kind of language. Because silence, in royal life, is rarely emptiness. It is calculation. It is understanding. It is the moment when someone realizes that the structure around them has shifted without their participation. She understood what Sandringham represented. She understood that this was never just about inheritance in the legal sense. It was about where Charles was placing his deepest trust. And by placing that trust in George, he was revealing something he had never said aloud, that the future he was preparing did not rely on her presence to sustain itself. This was not an act of removal. It was an act of bypassing. A quiet redirection of emotional continuity toward the next generation, leaving her outside the center of that continuity without ever explicitly pushing her away. Within palace walls, staff began to adjust almost instinctively, not because they were instructed to, but because they understood the emotional gravity of what had occurred. Sandringham had always functioned as a private axis of royal identity, and now that axis had shifted. Camilla's position remained intact in title, but something deeper had changed. Influence within the monarchy is not defined solely by rank. It is defined by proximity to its emotional core, and Sandringham had always been that core. Camilla recognized this with painful clarity. She understood that Charles had not acted against her. He had acted beyond her. He had made a decision rooted in legacy rather than partnership, permanence rather than presence. And while her public role remained secure, her emotional proximity to the monarchy's future had subtly, but unmistakably been reduced. It was not an exile. It was something quieter, something more final, a recognition that the future Charles was building belonged to George in a way that transcended anyone else. And perhaps the most difficult part was realizing that Charles had not hesitated. This had not been a moment of weakness. It had been a moment of conviction. He had known what he was doing. He had understood its implications, and he had chosen to do it anyway, accepting whatever emotional consequences might follow. Because for Charles, this decision was never about the present. It was about securing something beyond it. But Charles hadn't acted impulsively. This decision had been building quietly for years, shaped by forces few outside the inner circle ever saw. Behind closed doors, Charles had wrestled with a truth he rarely spoke aloud. He was no longer planning for his reign, he was planning for its end. And every decision now carried one terrifying question. Who could preserve what mattered most when he was gone? His answer would not be shaped by love, or marriage, or tradition. It would be shaped by survival, and survival demanded choosing George. This realization had not arrived suddenly. It had crept into Charles's thinking, slowly, quietly, over years marked by loss, responsibility, and the relentless awareness of time. He had spent his entire life preparing to inherit the crown, believing that once it arrived, clarity would follow. But clarity had not come. Instead, there came something heavier. The understanding that ruling was not about holding power, it was about surrendering it safely. Every monarch eventually faced the same private reckoning, not how to reign, but how to leave behind something that would endure. And Charles, more than most, understood what could happen when emotional continuity fractured inside the royal structure. He had seen it before. He had lived it. Moments where uncertainty crept into the monarchy's inner core, where personal relationships threatened institutional stability, where the emotional weight of succession created fractures no one spoke about publicly. Those memories never left him. They shaped his fears, they shaped his instincts, and most of all, they shaped his urgency. Because Charles no longer believed that stability could be assumed. He believed it had to be engineered, secured deliberately, before time could introduce unpredictability. George, in Charles's eyes, represented something rare. Not just youth, but clarity, a future unburdened by the emotional complexities that had defined previous generations. George was not entangled in old conflicts, not shaped by old divisions, not influenced by the emotional compromises that had made Charles's own journey so difficult. He was untouched, and that made him powerful not in authority, but in symbolic certainty. Charles saw in George something he could never fully claim for himself, a beginning unshadowed by the past. That realization made Sandringham more than a sentimental inheritance. It made it a strategic anchor. Charles knew that whoever controlled Sandringham controlled more than land. They controlled the monarchy's emotional refuge. They controlled the place where future sovereigns would retreat when the weight of duty became unbearable. And Charles could not risk that refuge becoming a point of dispute, negotiation, or emotional vulnerability after he was gone. He needed it secured, permanently, quietly, without interference. This was why he had acted alone, not out of secrecy, but out of necessity. Charles understood that decisions involving legacy often invited resistance not because they were wrong, but because they were irreversible. And irreversible decisions frightened people. They forced acceptance of realities others were not yet ready to face. By signing Sandringham over to George without consultation, Charles removed the possibility of delay. He ensured that the future he believed in would not remain theoretical. It would exist, it would be real, and it would be protected. But beneath the strategy, beneath the calculation, there was something deeply human driving him. Fear. Not fear of losing power, but fear of losing continuity. Fear that without decisive action, the monarchy's emotional foundation might weaken over time. Charles had spent his life existing in the shadow of legacy. Now, he was shaping one. And he understood that legacy was not built through speeches or ceremonies. It was built through choices made in silence. Choices that revealed what truly mattered when no one else was watching. In choosing George, Charles was not rejecting anyone else. He was choosing permanence over uncertainty. He was choosing the future over the present. And perhaps most profoundly, he was choosing peace for himself, for George, and for a monarchy he knew would one day have to survive without him. But Charles also knew something else. Sandringham was only the beginning, because once George became its guardian, everything else about his preparation would begin to change. But Charles wasn't the only one watching George closely. Others had already begun preparing him for something far greater than anyone realized. Prince George had grown up under the weight of invisible expectations. But suddenly, without warning, those expectations became real. Sandringham wasn't just a gift, it was a signal, a message from Charles that George was no longer just the future. He was now part of the present, and those closest to him began noticing subtle changes, conversations, briefings, and preparations that suggested George's destiny had accelerated overnight. For most of his young life, George existed in a carefully protected space between symbolism and normalcy. He was aware, in the abstract, that he represented continuity. He understood, in fragments, that his name carried consequences larger than himself. But those consequences had always belonged to tomorrow. They lived somewhere far ahead, distant and theoretical, safely separated from the rhythms of his daily existence. Sandringham changed that. It collapsed the distance between who he was and who he was destined to become. It transformed expectation into responsibility, not loudly, not forcefully, but with quiet permanence that could not be undone. Charles had not simply given George land, he had given him emotional territory, and that act carried a message deeper than any spoken instruction. It told George that he was trusted, not someday, but now. Trusted to carry a piece of the monarchy's emotional core. Trusted to inherit not just privilege, but stability itself. This trust was not explained in lengthy conversations. It was communicated through presence, through subtle inclusion, through moments where George was no longer shielded from certain discussions, but invited into their edges. He began hearing things differently, feeling things differently, understanding that his life was not merely unfolding, it was being shaped. Those around him felt the shift almost immediately. Advisors who had once spoken about George in distant, future-oriented terms began recalibrating their tone. He was no longer simply the heir to an heir. He was the guardian of something already entrusted to him. That distinction mattered. It changed how people spoke to him. It changed how they prepared for his future. It changed how they saw him. Because Sandringham was not a ceremonial gesture. It was a declaration that George's emotional integration into the monarchy had begun earlier than anyone anticipated. Charles had seen something in George that others were only beginning to recognize: a steadiness, a quiet strength, not loud or performative, but deeply rooted. He saw a resilience untouched by the emotional fractures that had complicated previous generations. George represented clarity, a continuity unburdened by unresolved conflict. And Charles knew that clarity needed reinforcement. It needed grounding. Sandringham would become that grounding, not as a place George would immediately control in practice, but as a place he would grow into emotionally, a constant presence in his psychological landscape, a reminder that he belonged not just to a family, but to a legacy that extended beyond time itself. More than anything, Sandringham strengthened George's connection to Queen Elizabeth's enduring influence. It tied him directly to her emotional legacy, reinforcing a lineage of quiet endurance and private strength. George was no longer merely her descendant. He had become her successor in spirit. The estate she had cherished, the refuge she had relied upon, was now his to carry forward. And that inheritance would shape how he understood himself, long before he ever wore the crown. This shift did not isolate George. It anchored him. It gave him certainty in a world defined by uncertainty. It gave him a foundation that would remain stable no matter how the monarchy evolved around him. And perhaps most importantly, it gave him a sense of belonging that transcended ceremonial duty. He was no longer simply waiting to become something. He was already becoming it. But this transformation did not exist in isolation, because every step George took forward reshaped the emotional and strategic landscape around him. And there was one person who understood this more deeply than anyone else. One person whose role was now quietly evolving alongside George's rise. A father who had spent his life preparing for the crown, now watching his own son step closer to it, in ways neither of them had fully expected. But this decision didn't just elevate George, it redefined William's position in ways few fully understood. Prince William didn't protest. He didn't question, because he understood something others didn't. This wasn't about bypassing him, it was about protecting George. William recognized the burden Charles was trying to lift from his son's future by anchoring his confidence now. And in that moment, William saw the truth clearly. Charles wasn't weakening his authority, he was strengthening George's survival. There was no shock in William's reaction, no quiet resentment, no private confusion. Only recognition, because William had spent his entire life standing at the intersection between inheritance and expectation. He understood what most people could never fully grasp, that legacy was not simply passed down when the time arrived. It was built slowly, deliberately, through decisions that seemed premature to outsiders, but made perfect sense to those carrying its weight. And when Charles chose George, William did not see a loss. He saw preparation. William understood Sandringham not as property, but as psychological armor. He knew what it meant to have a place that existed outside the crown's relentless demands. He had watched how deeply such places mattered to those who bore responsibility for the monarchy's survival. He had seen how emotional isolation could weaken even the strongest sovereign. And he had endured enough himself to know that George would one day face that same isolation. Charles was not removing anything from William. He was giving George something William himself had never received, so early a foundation strong enough to withstand the future before it arrived. There was also trust embedded in Charles's decision. Not just trust in George, but trust in William. because Charles understood that George's inheritance would only remain meaningful if William protected it, guided it, and reinforced its purpose. Sandringham was not meant to separate father and son. It was meant to unite them. It was a shared responsibility, passed down through blood and sustained through understanding. William was not being excluded from the equation. He was being entrusted with something far greater, the role of ensuring that George grew into the inheritance with strength rather than fear. In private, William recognized the deeper emotion behind Charles's actions. This was not strategy alone. It was vulnerability. Charles was confronting his own impermanence, confronting the reality that the monarchy's continuity would soon depend on those who came after him. William understood that fear intimately. He had felt it himself long before he ever became Prince of Wales. The fear of not being ready, the fear of not being enough, the fear of inheriting something that demanded everything from you while offering no protection in return. Charles was trying to shield George from that fear, trying to give him certainty where uncertainty had once defined everything. This realization did not create distance between William and Charles. It created alignment, a silent agreement that the monarchy's survival required emotional strength, not just institutional authority. William saw in Charles's decision a reflection of love expressed through sacrifice. Because Charles was not holding Sandringham for himself, he was letting it go, willingly, to ensure that George would never feel unanchored in the role waiting for him. That act carried enormous emotional cost, and William respected it. More than anything, William understood what Sandringham would become for George. Not a burden, but a refuge. Not an obligation, but a reassurance. It would stand as proof that he belonged, even during the moments when the crown threatened to strip him of everything else. William knew that this early inheritance would give George something priceless: confidence, rooted not in expectation, but in certainty. And in that certainty, William found peace. Because he knew that when George's time eventually came, he would not face it alone or unprepared. He would carry with him the quiet strength Charles had chosen to give him now. But while the emotional meaning of the decision strengthened the family's internal bond, its impact extended far beyond personal relationships, because within the palace itself, subtle forces were already beginning to respond. But beyond family emotions, the palace itself began shifting in ways few outside observers could detect. Inside palace corridors, subtle changes began unfolding immediately. Staff realignment, tests, adjusted briefings, quiet procedural updates, nothing public but everything meaningful. Because Sandringham's transfer wasn't just symbolic, it altered internal loyalties, it reshaped future influence, and those who understood royal power knew exactly what it meant. Charles had quietly begun transferring emotional authority before transferring the crown itself. The palace had always functioned like a living organism, sensitive to even the smallest shifts in royal gravity. It did not require announcements to understand change. It felt change. It responded instinctively, adjusting itself around the future long before the future arrived. And now, with Sandringham placed in George's name, the palace began recalibrating its emotional compass. Not openly, not dramatically, but with quiet precision that revealed how deeply Charles's decision had penetrated the institution's inner logic. Staff members who had once viewed George as a distant symbol began to see him differently. He was no longer only the heir to William. He was the direct holder of something sacred, something deeply personal to the monarchy's identity. This distinction mattered more than most people realized, because within palace culture, emotional authority often preceded official authority. Those who would one day hold power began attracting attention long before they formally possessed it. George had now crossed that invisible threshold. Advisors who operated in the shadows of royal continuity began adjusting their thinking. They understood that Charles's action had accelerated the monarchy's psychological transition. George was no longer an abstract future. He was a present reality woven into the monarchy's structural fabric. Conversations that once framed his preparation as distant began adopting a tone of immediacy. Planning timelines subtly shifted. Emotional investment quietly deepened. The palace was not rushing George forward. It was moving toward him. Institutional loyalty followed the same pattern it always had throughout royal history. It gravitated toward permanence. And Charles had just declared, without words, that George represented permanence. This did not diminish Charles's authority. It reinforced its continuity. By securing Sandringham in George's future, Charles had stabilized the monarchy's emotional trajectory. He had ensured that when uncertainty inevitably arrived, there would already be something fixed, something unshakable, something waiting. This quiet realignment extended beyond individuals. It influenced how the monarchy itself perceived its own future. Sandringham was not merely an estate, it was a psychological anchor. And now that anchor belonged to George. That reality reshaped how the institution imagined its survival. It created emotional reassurance within a system built on long-term endurance. Charles had removed ambiguity. He had replaced speculation with certainty. And certainty within royal structures was the most stabilizing force of all. Yet beneath this stability lay tension, because every shift toward the future required emotional detachment from the present. Those who had once existed at the emotional center of the monarchy now found themselves orbiting it instead. Not excluded, but repositioned. The palace did not resist this transformation. It absorbed it. It adapted. It understood that survival depended on accepting inevitability before inevitability arrived. Charles's decision had done something extraordinary. Without issuing commands, without altering titles, without announcing succession, he had changed the monarchy's emotional hierarchy. He had begun preparing the institution for a future that was no longer theoretical, a future already unfolding in quiet increments, a future already shaping the decisions of those who served it. The palace now existed in a state of quiet transition, not one defined by instability, but by preparation. Every conversation, every decision, every subtle shift carried the awareness that something fundamental had already changed. George was no longer simply waiting to inherit the monarchy's emotional center. He had already inherited part of it. And yet, even as the palace adjusted itself to this new reality, one truth remained deeper than all institutional strategy, deeper than all symbolic meaning. Because Charles's decision had not been driven solely by logic. It had been driven by something far more personal, something far more human. But beneath all strategy and symbolism lay the most profound truth of all, why Charles truly made this irreversible choice. In the end, Charles didn't make this decision for power. He made it for peace, for certainty, for protection. Sandringham wasn't just land, it was a message to George, a message to the future. And perhaps most quietly of all, a message to himself, that when his time came to let go, he would know he had already secured what mattered most. There comes a moment in every monarch's life when legacy stops being theoretical and becomes painfully real. For Charles, that moment did not arrive with ceremony or applause. It arrived in silence. It arrived in the form of a choice that could not be undone, a choice that forced him to confront truths he had carried quietly for years. He had spent his entire life waiting to inherit permanence, only to discover that permanence was never truly his to keep. It was his to protect, and protection sometimes required letting go before the world expected it. Sandringham had always been his refuge, his emotional sanctuary, in a life defined by relentless expectation. It was where he could exist not as king, but as a man carrying invisible burdens no one else could fully understand. Every monarch before him had known that feeling, the isolation, the quiet awareness that history was watching, measuring every decision, every hesitation. Charles understood that Sandringham represented the last place where that weight could be set down, even briefly. And by giving it to George, he was ensuring that when George's time came, he would not have to search for that refuge. It would already be waiting for him. This was not about control. It was about continuity over political convenience. He was choosing to secure something permanent in a world where everything else was temporary. He knew that titles could shift, public opinion could change, even the crown itself could feel fragile at times. But Sandringham, passed directly to George, would remain untouched by those uncertainties. It would stand as proof that the monarchy's emotional core had already been safeguarded, that its future had already been anchored. There was also something deeply personal in this act, something that went beyond strategy or duty. Charles was confronting his own impermanence, not with fear, but with acceptance. He understood that no monarch, no matter how powerful, could escape time. And rather than resisting that truth, he had chosen to prepare for it. Quietly, deliberately, without seeking recognition or reassurance. This decision was not about how he would be remembered. It was about what would remain strong after he was gone. For George, Sandringham would become more than inheritance. It would become reassurance. A silent promise from a grandfather who understood the loneliness waiting ahead. Charles had lived that loneliness. He had felt its weight from the moment he became heir, and he did not want George to face it unprotected. Sandringham would remind him that he belonged, even during the mom. Hence, when belonging felt impossible, that he was part of something unbreakable, even when everything else seemed uncertain. Charles's silence throughout this process made the decision even more powerful. He did not explain it publicly. He did not justify it. He did not seek approval, because he knew that the most important decisions in royal history were never announced with words. They were revealed through action, and his action had already spoken. He had secured the monarchy's emotional future long before the crown itself would change hands. Perhaps, in his own way, Charles had already begun saying goodbye not to his role, but to his responsibility for protecting what came next. He had done what every monarch ultimately must do. He had prepared the future to survive without him. He had ensured that when the time came, George would not inherit uncertainty. He would inherit strength, stability, confidence, and most importantly, a place where he could always find himself again. Because in that single quiet signature, Charles did something far greater than transfer ownership. He transferred certainty. He transferred emotional permanence. He transferred peace. And in that quiet signature, Charles didn't just change ownership, he changed the monarchy's emotional future, forever. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.